Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Just to have a quick recap, I explained that this intense fear we have of the future and the grief we have over things that have happened in the past, this can be countered if we were to master the concept of Tawheed, because when you are able to practice Tawheed in all its three levels, this helps to boost the ruh which only wants to connect with the Almighty. And since the ruh is inside the qalb, this helps to brighten and strengthen the qalb so that the heart is filled with positivity and hope and love of the divine. And it is at that stage when we have so much self-esteem, self-respect, self-confidence, that fear of what people will say, fear of what might happen in the future, or even grieving over things that have happened in the past, grieving over the sins that we have committed to the extent that we are paralyzed and we cannot move on, we have depression. These things do not exist when your qalb is absolutely filled with the love of God. You have certainty, you have tawakkul, trust in Allah's plan, you have trust in the qualities that Allah has given you, and you feel that you can overcome anything and everything. But what I want to discuss in this session is one of the problems that we have is how exactly do we learn to love God? Because for many of us, ever since we were young, we have heard about fearing God. We have heard that if you do this, then God will punish you. If you enter into these kind of activities, you will be faced with Jahannam. We have heard so much about God's anger, His punishment, His hellfire, His wrath, that the truth is, for many of us, we don't actually know what it means to love God. We don't understand the entire concept of divine love. So if you don't understand that, then filling your qalb, filling your heart with love of God becomes impossible. So really in this session, I want to address two questions. First of all, are we supposed to fear God or are we supposed to love Him? And secondly, if the idea is that we have to fill our hearts with the love of God, how exactly are we supposed to do that? To understand this, we need to first examine the concept of taqwa. A lot of people define taqwa as the fear of God. Okay, now this again, it just reinstates that entire concept that everything to do with God has to do with fear. And so, we barely hear anything to do with love or God's mercy or God's rahmat. It's all about fear. But if you were to actually examine the word taqwa, it doesn't actually have the words fear of God inside of it. Taqwa in its original form simply means to have a desire that you wish to abstain from things which you believe are evil, which you believe are wrong, and you have a desire to do things which you believe are good. So it's really talking about morals and values, right? So if you have this feeling that lying is bad, corruption is bad, fraud, stealing, all these things are evil, and you try your best to stay away from these things, while at the same time trying your best to do good things like being honest, being friendly, kind, and generous, that in itself is exactly what taqwa means. So in its actual literal form, it does not mean to fear God. It's about implementing your morals and ethics. And the interesting thing that you will find is that when you look at mankind, regardless of the time period or the race or the culture that people belong to, everyone seems to have the same basic set of morals and values. So, regardless of culture, you will have parents who are teaching their children that stealing is bad, lying is bad, fraud and corruption is bad. And you will have parents teaching their children that honesty is good, being kind and nice to people is good, showing respect to elders is good. So the fact that we all seem to have this exact same set of good and bad, same set of morals and values, stems from the fact that we all have a ruh which was blown into us from God Himself. And so the idea that we want to do things that we consider good and stay away from things that we consider bad, that in itself is what taqwa means. And therefore, if you are someone who has some level of taqwa, you are by definition a muttaqeen. And so from this you can understand that being a muttaqeen means that you lie on a spectrum. Okay, one end of that spectrum is people who have very, very low levels of taqwa, and the other end is people who have very high levels of taqwa. So being a muttaqeen is like a journey. Your level of taqwa over time can increase or it can decrease depending on how you choose to behave. depending on how willing you are to move away from things that are considered to be bad, wrong, sinful, and evil, and move towards things that are considered to be good. So based on this explanation of taqwa, a more accurate definition is that taqwa is God consciousness. It's not exactly the fear of God, but it's being conscious of God. So you are conscious of the fact that there are certain things Allah has designated as being evil and sinful and haram, and there are certain things that Allah loves and it will earn you the pleasure of God. Therefore, you have to strive to do things that will make Him happy, and you have to strive to abstain from things that will make Him upset. Therefore, what it really means to have taqwa is that you are conscious of the fact that Allah has set limits and boundaries for you, and you have to try and remain within those limits. You have to try and remain within those boundaries, because if you don't, you are conscious of the fact that you will be held accountable on the Day of Judgment. Now, of course, some people ask, well, why has God even set limits for us? Why has God even set boundaries for us? Why can we not just be free? Why can we not just do whatever we want, whenever we want? And the answer to that, of course, is the fact that when you look at society, the only way your society can work in a very orderly manner, in a very peaceful manner, is if you have an effective law and order system, right? So inside the society, citizens have to understand that there are certain things that they can do and they can practice and have freedom, but there are certain laws that they have to follow. If a citizen is allowed to do whatever he wants, whenever he wants, that can cause anarchy, that can cause him to do harm towards other people and not be held accountable for his actions, not having to face any kind of consequences. So even in any healthy, developed society, you need to have a law and order system so that people can be free, but at the same time, they have to be constrained. There has to be some boundaries, some laws, certain limits which have to be set. And the citizens should be permitted to have freedom within those limits. The same thing is what you see between a parent and a child. So parents will love their children. They will try and please their children and give their child whatever he or she wants. But at the same time, the parent's duty is to set limits. The duty is to set a boundary, informing the children that you can do whatever you want within these boundaries, but the minute you cross it, there will be consequences. And this is precisely the way that God interacts with us. So God tells us that being a Khalifa, being His servant and His slave, we have freedom of action. There are things that we can choose to do. There's a lot of behavior that is permissible, but there are boundaries that are set, because Allah has to ensure that while we are enjoying our freedom, we should not be harming other people. And at the same time, we should bear our overall purpose and our mission in mind. We have to understand that we have been put into this world for a reason, and that reason is to worship God. This is where the concept of Tawheed comes in. So bearing all of that in mind, Allah has set certain limits and boundaries for us, and of course within that we are free to act as we wish. So in this entire discussion, where does the concept of punishment come in? You know, the punishment that we have been hearing from our parents ever since we were young, that if you do this and God will punish you, then there's a Jahannam. And when you study the Quran, there are very explicit details mentioned of Jahannam, which in themselves are very scary. They're very detailed and they are terrifying. And a lot of people at times have issues that if God is so Ar-Rahman and He's so Ar-Rahim, why does He explain Jahannam as being this terrible fire that will burn skins and roast people and so on and so forth? And the simple answer to that is that Allah has introduced this concept of Jahannam and this hellfire because it has to be an effective deterrent. There has to be a punishment which is going to be so severe such that it deters us from doing things that are wrong. It makes us so terrified that we do not want to transgress the limits of God. And if we ever do, we immediately want to seek repentance. We immediately want to seek Allah's forgiveness. So if you think about it, it's not God who has to be feared. It is not Allah, the Almighty, who has to be feared. It is His punishment that has to be feared. So the fact that, when we were young, we were constantly told by our parents to fear God, the reality is Allah is incredibly loving. He is Ar-Rahman and He is Ar-Rahim, but it is His wrath, His curse, His punishment, His anger. That is what we have to fear. And you can understand this better, for instance, when you look at a parent and a child, right? A child will understand that if I go against my parents' rules, if I do something that will make my parents unhappy, then they will punish me. And it is the fear of that punishment that causes the child to remain conscious of what his parents like and what his parents dislike, so that he does not transgress. It is not the parents that the child is fearing. It is the punishment of the parents that the child fears. So in other words, if you have parents who refuse to give their child any form of punishment, they refuse to ever scold the child, in that situation, a child will never understand his limits and boundaries because there's nothing for him to fear. On the other hand, if you have parents who introduce very strict kind of punishments, then it is the punishment itself that is feared so much, it causes the child to start behaving. Therefore, the punishment has to be an effective deterrent. That is precisely what Allah has done with regards to Jahannam. It is the Jahannam, the hellfire, that has to be feared, because that is going to cause Muslims to take Allah's commands seriously and to keep a check on themselves and how they are behaving. In fact, when you study the Quran, what you realize is that the Jews and Christians have removed that concept of fear, the fear of the hellfire, so much that they have transgressed all kinds of limits and boundaries. And that just helps to show you as an example that if you remove the fear element completely, if you have no fear of Jahannam, or if you have this feeling that Jahannam is something you will never enter, then you will never actually be conscious of God. You will never actually be conscious of the limits and the boundaries that God has set. So therefore, taqwa will not be present inside you. So, for instance, when you study the tafsir, Allah tells us that the Jews have this claim that they are the chosen nation. And because they are the chosen nation, they will never enter into the hellfire. And even if they do, it'll just be for a few days. They will eventually be removed and put into Jannah because God loves them. They are a special chosen nation that has always received prophets and that has also received many books. Now, because they have been successful in removing the fear element, the fear of God's punishment, it is for that reason that they are no longer conscious of God's commands. So their rabbis have gone to the extent of distorting their own books, distorting the stories of prophets, even attributing heinous crimes and sins to prophets themselves. And of course, besides that, they have made radical changes to the laws of Moses. They have made many changes to the Sharia itself, and they have justified it. So this is just one example of what you see that happens if you completely remove the element of fear. That punishment is no longer a threat to you, so it no longer is able to deter you from doing things that are wrong. In the same way, when you look at the Christians, their belief that just Jesus Christ has died for the sins of mankind, so all you have to do is believe in Jesus, and believing in Jesus immediately grants you salvation. So instantly the threat of the hellfire is removed, the fear of Jahannam no longer exists, and therefore taqwa is not present. Right? And as a result, you see the immense distortions that Christians have made to religion. The idea that Jesus Christ is in fact a son of God and that Jesus himself is God, he should also be worshipped. And also the fact that, pork and bacon and all these things have now become halal for them. Alcohol has become perfectly halal for them. These are significant distortions that they have made only because the fear factor has been taken away. So Allah talking so much extensively about Jahannam and the hellfire is very important because we need to have a punishment that is an effective deterrent, that makes us conscious of God so that it inculcates taqwa. But that does not mean that it is God we are fearing. It is his punishment that he has set. It is his wrath that we have to fear. But the problem is, when we look back at our childhood and what we were taught by our parents, as I said, there was so much extensive talk about fear, about Jahannam and about the hellfire that there was hardly any talk about God's love and his mercy. And when you open up the Quran and you study the very first surah, Surah Fatiha, the two main attributes that Allah explains about himself is Ar-Rahman and Ar-Rahim. Two attributes that are entirely linked to Allah's infinite mercy and to Allah's love. There is no mention of Jahannam. There is no mention of any curse or wrath or the anger of God. So the first message that you see when you open up the Quran is not a message of fear. It's actually a message of love. And the beautiful wisdom behind that is that, you can never form a strong bond or a strong relationship with someone that is based on fear. You can only form a strong relationship with someone that is based on love. If it is based on fear, then we as human beings, if we are constantly terrified of someone, if we are constantly feeling fear of someone, we don't want to get close to that person. We want to break free from that person. We want to, find the first opportunity we can get to just run away and escape. The last thing we want to do is to get closer to that person if the entire relationship is based on fear. So it has to be based on love. And that is why Allah begins with His two beautiful attributes, Ar-Rahman and Ar-Rahim, to make His slave understand that the entire relationship with God must be focused on Allah's mercy, because hearing about His mercy, learning about His mercy, that is what infuses love inside of our hearts. And that is the beginning of our relationship with God. It has to be based on love. Now here is where, we can make this amazing analogy with a parent and a child relationship. When you look at children at a very young age, their entire relationship with their parents is based on love. So if you have a baby, and then after that when you have a toddler, you don't see strict punishments that are being administered. You don't see severe consequences that the child has to face if the child does something wrong. On the other hand, you see a parent as being very loving, overlooking many faults, and being very, very forgiving. So in the first couple of years, what the child experiences is only love. As the child gets older, then he has to start facing consequences for his actions. That's when the punishments start to enter. So in other words, the child is then grounded, or certain things that the child likes will be taken away from the child in order to make him understand that there will be consequences for your actions. But here's the most beautiful thing about all of this. When a child gets older and then he starts to face punishments because of, the behavior that he has shown, which might be inappropriate, over time, it is not just the punishment that he starts to fear. So in other words, he becomes conscious of what his parents like and what his parents dislike, not just because he fears the punishment, but more than that, he fears disappointing his parents. So because that relationship started off with love, as the child grows older, because his heart has the love of his parents inside of it, when he gets older now, he does not want to do things that will upset his parents, not just because he fears being punished, but more than that, it is the guilt of knowing that I have disappointed my parents. The guilt of knowing that my parents are crying, or they are grieving, or they are sad and depressed because of something that I have done. I have made them feel this. And it is that guilt which really drives the child to do things that will please his parents. So this is the most important thing, that the fear of punishment is there. But more than that, it is the guilt of displeasing the parents, because the relationship started off with love. That is precisely what Allah is teaching us over here. Your relationship with God has to start with love. It has to start with the focus on Him being Ar-Rahman and Ar-Rahim, all the infinite blessings, all the infinite things that Allah has given you, all the times when you have ignored Allah, yet He has continuously provided for you, continuously loved you, and He remains waiting patiently for you, so that you can start to acknowledge Him and worship Him instead of ignoring Him. So when you start to focus on God's love and you establish that relationship that you have with God based on love, then after that you become conscious of the limits and the boundaries that Allah has set. Not only because you fear God's punishment, not only because you fear Jahannam, which is a very effective deterrent, but more than that, you have this guilt that I displeased my Lord, that my Lord had done so much for me, but I have made Him upset. And it is that guilt which is what will drive us towards doing things which will earn Allah's pleasure. This is really the most crucial factor. For many of us, we did not start our relationship with Allah based on love. We started it off based on fear, because that's all we were taught about. And as I have just mentioned, when you start a relationship that is based on fear, all you want to do is actually just get away from that entity. So instead of wanting to do more, instead of wanting to get closer to Allah, all you want to do is actually run away. Because eventually you get tired of fearing Him. You get tired of hearing about Jahannam and Allah's anger and Allah's wrath. And you reach the extent where you think, you know what, it's never going to be enough. No matter what I do, there's always going to be something that will upset Allah, and I am destined for Jahannam, so I might as well as just enjoy in this dunya, because my akhirah is doomed. That's where the depression sets in. That's why some of us, we grieve over our sins and we never get over it. We never have this feeling that Allah can forgive, and we never have positivity and hopefulness in our hearts. All we have is despair. That's why we have so much fear of the future, because we cannot trust God. How do you trust an entity that you haven't learned to love, you only have learned to fear? When you examine us as human beings, when you examine the kind of people in your life whom you trust, like your family or your friends, the people whom you trust are also the people whom you love. It is not the people you fear. Trust is something that is based on the emotion of love. It is not based on the emotion of fear. When you feel that I love this person and this person truly loves me, that's when you know that this person will not do anything to harm me. I can trust this person. But when our relationship with God is only based on fear, how are we supposed to have tawakkul? How are we supposed to trust Him? And when people tell us that if something bad has happened to you, then there is khair in it because it has come from Allah, we cannot see that khair because we cannot understand how magnanimous and beautiful and loving God is. We have not learned to understand Him through love. We have learned to understand Him through fear, through His punishments, through His anger. And, so for Muslims like this, when they study the lives of the Sahabas, and they see that, there were companions who were struggling and they were doing jihad and fighting for the cause of Allah. They absolutely loved God so much they were willing to give up their lives and sacrifice everything that they had for God. Many of us cannot understand. We cannot relate to it. And we end up saying, well, they were Sahabas. And, they had a huge amount of iman. We cannot possibly compare ourselves to them. The truth is they were Sahabas, but they were human beings who had a heart and a nafs just like we do. They had a qalb very similar to ours. They had a ruh very similar to ours. But the reason that they were willing to enter into so much struggle and jihad for the cause of Allah was simply because they had learned to love Him, and we still have not learned to do that. The reason they had so much taqwa, they were so conscious of God, constantly keeping a check on themselves, constantly being vigilant, was because, yes, Jahannam, the fear of Jahannam was a very effective deterrent. They were terrified of Jahannam. But more than that, they were terrified of having this guilt that we have earned the displeasure of God. That when we are standing in front of Allah on the Day of Judgment, Allah will look at us with displeasure. So what we all need to do as Muslims is we need to revisit our basic relationship with God. If we are suffering from low self-esteem, low confidence, if we are constantly fearing the future, if we are constantly grieving over the things that have happened in the past, and we are living in that victim mentality, we don't know how to be a survivor. We have no idea what it means to trust God. We have no idea how to inculcate tawakkul inside of us. And we cannot understand the concept of khair, the fact that there is khair in everything that comes from Allah. All of this stems from the fact that there is a core problem in our link and our connection with God. It is a connection that is built on fear, and we need to revisit that and change that, first learning how to love God. And in fact, when you study the design of the qalb, we can actually understand that this is something that Allah is teaching us from the very first day. It's there in the Quran. The qalb is designed in such a way that within the qalb, the core, the center of it is something which is called the lub. And the lub, by definition, is the part of your intellect that is inspired by the divine. It is actually that part which is ignited when you feel divine love. So it is not something that can be ignited when you feel fear of the divine. Fear does not ignite your lub. It is love of God, love of the divine that suddenly energizes and activates the lub. So really the lub is that higher level of akal, that higher level of intellect, that wisdom that you actually get. And that is obtained when you look at the world around you, you look at your environment, your family, and most importantly, you look within yourself. You look at the kind of person you are and the kind of life that you have had, and you search for God inside all of these things. So you start to see the signs of Allah. You start to focus on the mercy of Allah. It's not that, you are searching inside your life for all the bad things that have happened to you. It's not that you're searching for all the areas where you faced hardship so that somebody can tell you, see, that just proves that God doesn't love you. See, that just proves that God is always punishing you. That proves that God is someone you should fear. The fact is, don't focus on fear anymore, focus on love. So look back at your life, back at your environment and your family and your friends, and search for all those moments where God's mercy is evident, God's love is evident. Places where there was some kind of hardship or some difficulty, but it was God who removed that and took you out of it. So instead of focusing on the fact that you were once in some kind of a test or you were in some kind of a hardship, focus on how you were able to get out of that hardship. Because getting out of it, that is the part where God's mercy comes in. That's the part where God's love comes in. And then you focus on the fact that what kind of a Muslim were you in the past? How many prayers did you do? How many times did you strive and struggle in the cause of Allah? And the fact that we barely did anything, yet Allah keeps taking us out of tests and trials, yet Allah keeps granting us His blessings and His mercy, that is what melts our heart, that is what inculcates love. That is how our relationship with God has to start, and that is what activates the akal. The lub, the divine love, which is inside the core of the heart, that gets energized and activated when we keep focusing on all the beautiful things that Allah has shown us and done for us in our lives. We start pondering over it. We start reflecting over it. We start using our intellect and asking the right kind of questions. And these are questions because we want to connect with God through love. Once that lub then becomes activated, which is the core of your heart, then the qalb starts to slowly get filled up with positivity and hope. And this is what makes your relationship with God eventually so strong that tawakkul becomes easy. Understanding God's wisdom and God's plan becomes easy. Having this conviction that Allah's help will definitely come, that becomes easy. But at this point, many of us can have this question that, okay, I have been pondering over God's mercy for a very long time. I have been reflecting on my past for a very long time. I know all the times when God has helped me, but I still feel depressed. I still feel the fear of the future. I still don't have tawakkul. And the reason for that is because there is a second very important thing that the Quran tells us repeatedly, which needs to be done in order to activate that lub. The first thing, as I mentioned, is reflecting over God's infinite mercy and blessings and all of God's love that He has shown you. But the second very important thing is that you have to detach yourself from the love of this world. That does not mean you detach yourself from dunya completely. That does not mean you have to live in isolation. But it just means you have to stop obsessing and chasing over this world. You have to stop obsessing over the things that you once had which you have now lost. You have to stop obsessing over the kind of goals and objectives that you still have, that you are chasing, goals and objectives that are linked to this dunya. For instance, grades, profession, marriage, spouse, children, all of these things are linked to this world. And when your association and your attachment or your obsession with these things are still so strong, you are violating Tawheed, as I have mentioned before. And so your lub cannot be activated. And so a person like this can spend years pondering over God's mercy in the past and trying their best to love God, but they will always fail because their heart is filled with layers of greed, pride, arrogance, love for this world. There is so much of that your lub cannot be activated. You cannot be a person of wisdom. You cannot be a person who understands divine love. If you are saying that you want to love God, but in terms of your mindset, you are actually just interested in loving dunya. You are just interested in loving and chasing your dreams and your desires, and you don't really care about what makes God happy. So just to summarize, if you really want to try and rid yourself of depression and grief, you have to learn to stop chasing your dreams and your goals and worshiping them. It's okay as a human being to set goals. It's good and it's productive to set objectives for yourself because it's important to challenge yourself and to keep yourself working hard. But to start worshiping them, to start obsessing over them, to the extent that those goals and objectives become the purpose of your life, that is having a heart which is filled with greed. And a heart that is filled with greed can never be filled with divine love, because they're completely the opposite things. So start working on your mindset and on your beliefs. And the reason I keep stressing upon this is because every time I talk to students about things like this, they keep having the same response, that I have tried, but I don't know how to do it. Can you please give me the steps? Can you please tell me what I'm supposed to do? Can you please tell me where I'm going wrong? And no matter how much I tell them that it's about your mindset, you're still chasing dunya, you're still obsessing over dunya. They admit to it, they agree that they are doing this, but they just say, well, we don't know how to stop. And that is where your element of choice comes in. You have been created as a strong and intellectual human being that has a choice. You choose to fill your heart with the love of God, or you can choose to fill your heart with the love of dunya. You can choose to obsess over certain things in this world, or you can choose to obsess over God and God's infinite mercy. It's your mind, so you can decide what you want to focus on. And it's your heart, so you can decide what you want to fill it up with. So when we keep saying that it's beyond us, we cannot stop thinking about this world. We just cannot have the love of God in our hearts. That these statements by itself have no meaning. They have no base. Allah knows that you have complete choice. That's why Allah will hold you accountable. If He knew that you have no choice, that it is beyond you, then He would not hold you accountable. The reason we will be held accountable is because we have the capability of doing all of these things. Yet we are choosing, deliberately choosing, to chase those things that will end in misery, that will end in depression, grief, anxiety, stress, extreme fear of the future. We are choosing to follow a path that only ends in misery, while the Quran is making it very clear that there is a different path we can take. A path that will end in only contentment and peace. May Allah grant us that contentment and peace. May Allah give us the opportunity, the ability to alter our mindset, alter our beliefs, activate the lub that is inside of us, energize our hearts, and help us to overcome all the obstacles we face in life. Assalamu alaikum.